Welcome, everyone. Today's explainer takes a look at something completely wild. We usually think of history in terms of kings, generals, and massive treaties, right? But what if I told you the map of an entirely new continent was essentially redrawn because of hats?
So let's just dive right in with a pretty crazy question. How exactly did a European fashion trend birth an entirely new nation? I know it sounds like a massive stretch, but we're going to unpack the profound, totally unintended consequences of European consumer demand. Because this wasn't just about money, it was this massive economic catalyst that triggered cultural fusions, entire ecological shifts, and legal battles that are literally still being fought in Supreme Courts today. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, we've got the global fur craze. 2, ecosystems and empires collide. 3, women of the fur trade. 4, the birth of the Métis. And finally, 5, the battle for identity. Let's get into it.
Part 1. The global fur craze, paying for sweeping geopolitical shifts in pelts.
Okay, so it all actually started as a side hustle. Back in the 16th century, European cod fishermen, mostly Basque, were out fishing off the freezing North Atlantic coast. Naturally, they needed warm clothing for the brutal voyage home, so they started making these really simple coastal trades with indigenous peoples. They'd swap metal items for worn, native-tanned beaver robes. The French actually called these worn robes castor gras, or greasy beaver. And as it turns out, the sweat and the wear and tear from human use made those pelts incredibly soft and absolutely perfect for felting. Suddenly, European hat makers just couldn't get enough of them, and this accidental, tiny coastal trade just exploded into a lucrative, highly competitive continental industry.
And this craze was truly continent-wide. We usually hear all about the northern beaver trade with the French, British, and Dutch, right? But at the exact same time, there was this massive deerskin trade happening in the southeast that was completely transforming relationships between indigenous chiefdoms and British and Spanish colonists. And meanwhile, all the way out on the Pacific coast, you had Russian explorers pushing incredibly deep into Alaska, driven almost entirely by the hunt for those ultra-soft sea otter pelts.
Which brings us to Part 2, Ecosystems and Empires Collide. The violent ripples of consumer demand.
So things got destabilized incredibly fast once indigenous groups realized that having access to European iron tools and firearms was basically essential for survival. Look at this timeline. In 1624, the Iroquois push out the Mohican just to get Dutch trade access. By 1649, they completely devastate the Huron to eliminate them as middlemen. Down south in 1715, the Yamasee War erupts directly from manipulative, predatory European debt practices. And by 1731, the French are launching a ruthless campaign against the Natchez just to secure the Mississippi River. It was basically a total restructuring of power, fueled by violence.
You know, historical archives can sometimes feel a bit cold and detached, right? But listen to this quote from 1684 by the Onondaga chief, O'Troudy. He was explaining exactly why his people were at war with neighboring nations, and he stated it so simply. They came to hunt beavers on our lands. I mean, that just humanizes the history instantly. These massive territorial expansions and all the resulting bloodshed, they were directly motivated by the ecological exhaustion of beaver populations and this absolutely desperate need to secure more pelts.
Moving on to Part 3, Women of the Fur Trade, the linchpins of global commerce.
Here's a really crucial piece of the puzzle. This vast network wasn't just a transactional economy. It was a kinship economy. European traders figured out pretty quickly that if they wanted to survive the winters and secure exclusive trading rights, they had to integrate into indigenous communities. And they did this through what were called country marriages. And far from being passive participants, indigenous communities actually encouraged these marriages. It was a highly strategic diplomatic move to ensure a steady supply of European goods and essentially box out rival groups.
But the day-to-day experience of indigenous women varied wildly depending on where they lived. For example, Ojibwe and Cree communities used these vast, complex river networks, so the men would often travel away to trade, which left the women in highly influential positions back home. They were commanding trade routes, harvesting vital wild rice, and actually building the canoes. Conversely, up in the subarctic, northern Athabascan women didn't have navigable rivers. Travel was unbelievably harsh and overland, and women were frequently forced into carrying heavy baggage for hundreds of miles, which severely marginalized their social status. It's a huge contrast. Yet, despite the hardships, many women commanded immense agency and spiritual power. Take this incredible story of Oshagushkodanakwa, an Ojibwe woman. When she was young, she went on a vision quest and dreamed of a white stranger who she believed was her guardian spirit. Years later, when a British fur trader proposed to her, she accepted. She used her own dream vision to claim spiritual authority over her destiny, and she eventually became a prominent trader and a major decision-maker in her community. These women were active, powerful participants in this entire system.
Part 4. The birth of the Métis. A new people emerges from the archives.
Okay, quick definition time. Ethnogenesis, the formation and development of a distinct ethnic group. The emergence of the Métis is actually one of the rare instances in modern history where historians can track the ethnogenesis of a people in real time right through the archives. They weren't just individuals who happened to be mixed, they forged their own unique culture, their own language, and their own society.
So the Métis, they didn't just establish themselves as some byproduct of the trade. They were absolute economic innovators. They became their own independent occupational class. They built this highly resilient hybrid economy that basically blended European trade mechanics with indigenous kinship values of sharing and exchange. And when the beaver trade eventually slowed down, they pivoted seamlessly. They became the major suppliers of pemmican, which was basically the ultimate survival food of the era, and buffalo robes. They even invented those iconic Red River carts, which gave them incredible mobility across the plains. They literally built a distinct self-governing society from the ground up.
And finally, Part 5, the battle for identity. From historical records to the Supreme Court. Now, the academic debate on what it actually means to be Métis today is absolutely fascinating. The traditional lens, which has been used for decades, defined the Métis mostly by their biological and cultural mixedness, a blend of European and indigenous heritage. However, sociologist Chris Anderson makes a really strong alternative argument. He contends that calling the Métis mixed relies on outdated, racist colonial categories. His lens argues that the Métis must be defined by their distinct political peoplehood and sovereign nationhood, not just their genealogy. It's a huge paradigm shift, moving from viewing them as just a demographic phenomenon to recognizing them as a sovereign political entity. But here's the catch. The historical archives themselves, they are a total mess. Colonial administrators back then simply didn't know how to categorize this new group of people. So they just throw around a bewildering, totally contradictory array of terms like half-breeds, métifs, and bois bolés. And because the colonizers were constantly confused, modern historians and legal experts today struggle to objectively identify who was actually métis in those primary sources. And that archival confusion builds into massive, real-world legal consequences today. Take the landmark 2003 Supreme Court case, R.V. Powley. The whole issue was whether the Métis of Sault Ste. Marie had Aboriginal hunting rights. Now, to win, they had to prove historical continuity of their customs. And they had to do it using those very same messy, confused colonial archives. But they succeeded. They achieved a massive victory that secured material hunting rights and legally recognized the Métis as a distinct rights-bearing community.
But it's not all seen as a pure victory. Scholar Jeremy Patzer brings up a really critical counter-argument. He points out that court cases like Powley essentially force Indigenous people to pass restrictive cultural tests that were designed by the very people who colonized them in the first place. Think about it. In order to win your rights, you have to successfully perform an authentic version of your history that satisfies a modern colonial court. It basically forces a historically fluid, highly adaptable people to prove they have remained statically frozen in the past. So, that brings us to a final, lingering thought for this explainer. We've seen how the demand for felt hats literally cascaded into wars, brand new economies, and the birth of a nation. But when the historical archives were written by confused administrators, and modern courts rely on those exact same archives to grant rights today, how do we redefine identity? It's an incredible reminder that the ripple effects of the past are never quite settled, are they? They are living, breathing realities carrying immense weight in the present. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep asking questions, and I will see you next time.